So far we've talked about, I've asked you a few questions on what is the gap exactly. And then we talked a little bit about, effective communication specifically. And now, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about maximizing business value through communication. And maybe these questions are a little bit more in the context of NNA's practice, to be selfish. So how can IT and business teams use communication to support mergers and acquisitions, which is an area of expertise for Nestell Associates? What's your thoughts there in that particular environment? Pretty dynamic, high paced, high pressure, turnarounds expected pretty quickly, pretty high demands for a lot of significant change in a short period of time, typically. What would be your answer to that question?
Yeah. So first, that is a huge question. How long have we got?
Pandora's box. Yeah.
So this is an area that I do have some experience in. I even wrote a guide with a wonderful co-manager, a lady called Tina Cox, an all-round awesome human being. And we wrote a guide for the company we worked at to help with future M&As. And from a comms perspective, these are the few pieces I would say. So three high-level things for both business and technical teams. One, don't be precious about your stuff. Two, accept that change will happen. And three, describe things in language that other people will understand. And I'll give a tiny bit more detail about each of these. So the first one, don't be precious about your stuff. Even if you think your systems or your processes are the secret sauce for your business, if you've been acquired or you're being merged, please be open to learning how the other team does it. How does the other company, how does the people you're merging with do it? You may learn something. You may be able to bring the best of each thing together. So don't be precious about your stuff. Learn about the other side. And then accept that change will happen. If you've been bought, there are definitely going to be changes. You may well need to shift absolutely everything to the buyer's systems. You may have to do a huge data migration, and that can really suck. But if you don't get on board with it, you'll spend the rest of forever trying to manage two separate or two badly coupled systems, and you'll create a legacy nightmare that nobody will be grateful for. So change is going to happen. So have the mindset of how can I best support the change and make it work? Do that rather than trying to block it. And that goes for business and for IT. I say systems and processes. They can be business systems and processes as well.
So Chris, in your previous answer there, for your number 2 point was to accept change. What role does effective communication play in managing organizational change, especially in the context of large-scale ERP implementations or business systems implementations?
It's critical. Effective communication is critical because without good comms, change fails, period. Bad comms equals failure of whatever you're trying to achieve in this organizational change. Now, when I say the good comms, it doesn't mean everyone has to agree, but they do all need to understand. They need to understand the overall goals, understand the overall approach, understand how to tell each other what's happening as the implementation goes along. And I don't mean more status updates. I mean connecting key people so that they can communicate within their teams. And this requires a full spread of communication techniques across a wide range of different communication situations. So we've got relationship building, status updates to executives, detailed planning for system integrations or data migrations, sharing of processes, solving problems, and so on. All of those situations require good communication. And to do it at a high level, we should be using similar language. So talking in terms of goals and problems, but also talking in terms of effort and outcomes rather than system names or data types.
Yeah, I like that, Chris. It seems to me that effective communication can actually be a buzzword sometimes. And I like how you described, really it's all about, it's a full spread of communication techniques and tactics that you can apply across a spectrum of communication scenarios, right?
Yeah.
And, I think that's very well said, Chris, and I appreciate that. And, I think sometimes what we see is some organizations and leadership will talk about effective communication, but they don't take it beyond some initial conversations, right? Maybe for some organizations, it's a it's a memo, it's an organizational wide email, a couple of
Mm,
times a month.
yeah.
And I think it's important that that just doesn't do the trick. There's so many other tactics that you can take out of your effective communication toolbox and build it into your large scale organizational change plan and just really improve some of the examples you gave. And, maybe it's a town hall, maybe it's a regular, well ran meeting. Maybe it's just being consistent about having people understand the value of the pointers that you provided our listeners, and don't be protective about your stuff, accept change, use a language others will understand. So again, I think it's one of those things that we alluded to earlier in the conversation, Chris. If you really want to be an effective communicator and you want your organization to be good at effective communication, it takes intent. You have to be deliberate. And again, it goes back to your workout buddy, right? Just don't
Yes.
talk about it and read about it. Do something internally to put that mechanism in place in which to support and execute and enforce these principles and these tactics. So how can our clients, Nestell Associates clients, which are private equity firms, how can private equity firms leverage improved IT business communication to maximize investment value in their portfolio companies? And again, I know that's intentionally a bit of a broad question, but how can you kind of bring that down a little bit and speak in a little bit more layman terms for the private equity operating partner? What's the value? We're sitting here, we're talking about effective communication and tactics and being deliberate, but at the end of the day, how does that bring in value to to the investors?
Oh, yeah. The answer is actually quite simple and small. The investors should invest in it. And I'll unpack that a little bit. What investors in an organization should invest money in training and invest time in helping the companies communicate well. And it pays dividends in all kinds of ways. For example, status updates from the company to the investors will become shorter, clearer, and contain more valuable advice and information. Teams internally will work better together, which delivers better outcomes for the business, which is what the investors want. In fact, I've recently been talking to a couple of venture capitalists about making certain types of communication training and support a condition of receiving funding. And the client company has to accept the time and effort it takes to work on their comms if they want the money from the VC. And it's not a full service yet, but there's interest, and we're working on that. And the VC community has sort of definitely pricked its ears up because they recognize how valuable it will be just to have those shorter, clearer updates, how effective internal comms is, and how effective the businesses can be when the businesses can communicate with their clients, with their vendors, with their supply chains, and so on.
So, Chris, I will say, as you'd mentioned, you say it pays dividends in all sorts of ways, I think was your exact comment. And I would say that's not just some abstract theory, right? I mean, it is proven literally, scientific peer-reviewed articles that organizations with a healthy culture, of which communication is a significant attribute, there is a high correlation between those organizations that rate high in their organizational culture towards organizational performance. I think that the data to support that it's well established and undeniable.
It really
Yeah.
is. And
Yeah.
for a very specific example, the percentage of projects and programs that fail is something like 70%. It depends which year's study or which source you're looking at, but around 70% of projects and programs fail. The ones that don't fail generally have better communication levels within those organizations because risks and issues are communicated more clearly and they're understood. So they can be reacted to and planned for better. Because when we have shared understanding, we know what we should do about, or at least we have the right information to make good choices about risks and so on. So if investors want the projects within their companies to succeed, then improve the communication. It's going to take a big step towards improving project and program success rates. If the communication is improved at all levels of the company.
Yeah.
It can't work just at the top and not at the bottom, and it can't work just at the bottom or in the middle and not at the top. Communicating within a company requires a consistent approach to bring up that skill level across the board. But it's worth doing.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate your time. And I do want to ask you two more questions here. And I don't think there will be much to add from your advice shared so far, but just to kind of pull it together. In the world of private equity, especially one where there's growth through mergers and acquisitions and rapid growth, Can you share insights on how to maintain this improved communication as organizations evolve and grow under such conditions? Your answer is probably going to be the same as we've discussed in the conversation so far, but
Yeah.
under just a high growth environment. I mean, acquisitions, we actually have a client right now where over the last couple of years, they've added 4 to 5 entities, and that's their continued path for the next 3 years. So any advice in terms of the advice you've provided our listeners already so far, but does any of that change, or is there anything to add in terms of a much accelerated growth environment?
Yeah, I'll do this in 4 bullet points. First of all, make it important and make it valued. Second of all, train the managers as well as staff. We just talked about that. Train new hires. Don't accept backward steps when people come in. And then the fourth thing is, how do you measure it? Show me the measurements in a company and I'll show you where the problems are in performance, because people work to the measures.